Welcome to Coming from Left Field, where we have conversations about politics, books, and current events with your host, Greg Goddles and Pat Cummings. Howard Zinn, author of A People's History of the United States, a book that sold over 2 million copies, died on January 27, 2010. Shortly after, then Governor of Indiana Mitch Daniels got on his computer and fired off an email to the state's top education officials. This terrible anti-American academic has finally passed away. He demanded the book be banned before more young people are force-fed a totally false version of our history. I thought Zinn's history book was excellent. What's going on here? Let's discuss. Well, warm greetings. We are very excited to have David Detmer, Dr. David Detmer, who is a professor of philosophy at Purdue University Calumet. And
Actually, it's now Purdue University Northwest. The name has been changed, but yeah.
well, you just goes to show you can't trust the internet anymore, David.
Right.
When you're doing your research, you got to be careful. And we are just so excited about talking to you about your book, Zinnophobia. And this is a battle over history and education and politics and scholarship. And I just noticed for the first time, it was kind of small print, but Noam Chomsky blurbed your book and said, a major contribution to bringing Zinn's great contributions to even broader public attention and exposing features of intellectual and political culture that are of no little interest. So that's great that you got Noam to write you an intro. So welcome to our podcast.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me.
Tell us the origin of this book. You've written so many books on philosophy, and all
Yes.
of a sudden you break out and write this book on the controversy surrounding Howard Zinn and the book banning associated with his works. Tell us about this.
Sure. So how this happened is when Mitch Daniels, who had been the governor of Indiana, when he became president of Purdue University. Now, Purdue University has several campuses. I'm at Purdue University Northwest, but Mitch Daniels became president of the whole system. And right around that time, there was a major news article about Mitch Daniels. Turns out an AP reporter used the Freedom of Information Act to get at some of Mitch Daniels' emails. And it turns out that when Howard Zinn died, Mitch Daniels put out a really nasty email to his subordinates saying something to the effect of, this horrible academic has finally died. Isn't it great, that he's dead? He wrote this terrible book, A People's History of the United States. I understand it's widely used in colleges and high schools. We've got to make sure it's not being used in Indiana. Can someone look into this and make sure it's not being used in Indiana? If it is, we've got to ban it. We've got to disqualify it. It can't be used for credit. So that was pretty startling to me. And here we have Mitch Daniels, my former governor, now the president of my university, and he's attacking Howard Zinn, my former professor, because when I was an undergraduate at Boston University, I took a couple of courses from Howard Zinn. So I thought, well, I have to look into this. And so my first idea was simply to write an article about censorship, in this context. But what turned it into a big, long book is when Mitch Daniels started to get some criticism in the press. A lot of writers in the mainstream press, by the way, he normally gets undeserved good press, in my view. But this is one case where he got some bad press. Some mainstream writers in the mainstream press were saying, hey, that's a bit of an overreach for a governor to be trying to get to, ban books by his political, opponents. And so the way Mitch Daniels defended himself is he said, you don't have to take my word for how lousy Howard Zinn is. Here, I've got some quotes by eminent historians and other scholars who say Howard Zinn is terrible. And he said, and I've got an even longer list available by request. So I shot Mitch an email asking for the longer list, and eventually his secretary gave me the longer list. And so I thought, well, I want to read these things. This goes beyond the normal scholarly criticism. People were saying very, very harsh things about Howard Zinn. And so I wanted to read, well, what kind of evidentiary basis do they have? And I'll just add parenthetically, it was not what I expected. What I kind of expected was, well, these are people who probably just don't like his politics. And so they're going to sort of tart up and any little thing that might be considered a mistake or anything where they just have a legitimate scholarly disagreement, they'll tart it up into him being a terrible scholar. That's what I expected to find. What I in fact found was just far, far worse than that. What I found was over and over again, these critics just made appalling mistakes. They would misquote Zinn, they would take him out of context, they would claim that he never said something which in fact he had said many times, or just a bunch of really real blunders. And so I started writing about the critics. And the reason the book ended up being so long is I didn't want to be accused of cherry picking. And so I went through all the critics on Mitch Daniels' list, everyone else I could find who backed Mitch Daniels, and then I went through every single one of their criticisms. And so that's how, and that's why the book ended up being called Zinnophobia, because I think what I uncovered is something just really remarkable, that we have these scholars who are Pulitzer Prize winners who teach at Harvard and Stanford and Princeton and places like that, just producing unbelievably incompetent work in the context of their criticisms of Howard Zinn. So that's how that's how I came around to writing the book.
I think Greg and I obviously grew up with Howard Zinn. He's one I am I speaking for you, Greg? I mean, he's
Sure,
probably one
sure.
of your, favorite historians. I mean, he is mine. I think we need to back up and say who Howard Zinn was for a lot of our audience. Like my father, he was in the Air Force in World War II. He was a bombardier. Um, and he had some trauma associated with his experience flying in the Air Force. The last mission he dropped, they dropped napalm. He went back and visited the village that he bombed. He went on to get a PhD, worked in Spelman, was a historian. And because of his experiences, he was one of our first, I guess, not of our first, he was definitely an anti-war protester. Um, Went with Daniel Berrigan to pick up prisoners of war in North Vietnam because the North Vietnamese didn't want to release them to the United States government, so they wanted to release it to the peace movement. Arrested, fired from his job in Spelman because he was an anti-war protester. And the book described how radical the people's history was in looking at American history, how he took a new perspective and how and why it sold 2 million, 2 million, sold 2 million copies, 2 million.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would say a couple of things make it very different from earlier books. So the kind of history textbooks, excuse me, that I read when I was in the public schools, for example, they very much had a top-down focus. History is all about what the presidents do, what the Supreme Court does, what the military generals do, what the business leaders do. And this is spun in a very positive way. It's highlighting, the brilliance, the wisdom of these leaders. Zinn, in contrast, took the view. Well, first of all, he highlighted quite a few of the misdeeds of the people who are celebrated in the traditional histories, pointing out there's a bias in the previous textbooks that they want to play things as positively as they can. So he brought in some of the negative stuff there. But I think even more importantly, the book makes the case that whenever there has been significant positive progressive change in American history, it has been as a result of agitation from below. So you have people involved in anti-war movements, anti-racism movements, people fighting for environmental causes, et cetera, et cetera. And politicians tend to only reluctantly make concessions to these groups once these groups have succeeded in mobilizing the public. So it's very much a kind of bottom up history rather than a top down history. Another thing I would point out, maybe this isn't quite as significant, but I think it's worth mentioning, is Zinn had a real sensitivity to the arts. Um, in my book, I have some quotations from some of his famous students, like Alice Walker being an example, a
Hmm. Hmm.
student of his at Spelman. And she points out that when he taught Russian history, he would assign, in addition to the more traditional materials, he would assign literature. He'd assign Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, Chekhov, and so on. And Zinn, as I'm sure both of you know, he was also a playwright. He wrote 3 plays. So he had a real sensitivity to the arts. So in people's history, there's more attention paid to poets, novelists, musicians, painters, etc., than in most history books. But that, I guess, is not what offended the critics. What offends the critics is more the criticism that he has of our great national heroes and the celebration of ordinary people who are part of agitation from below.
Greg, you were about 30 or so when this book came out. Were you in your doctoral program in philosophy? What did I'm
Came out
sure
in
you
19,
read this book when it came out. What did it mean to you, and how did it
it came out in 1980, I believe. Is that correct?
That is right.
David? Yeah, and I think what was most attractive, is it's a popular history. And there's nothing new really in the book that I hadn't read before. I mean, you mentioned, in your critique of, is it Hamlin? You mentioned William Appleman Williams, and he's done a lot of that Cold War history long before he did it. And people like Herbert Aptheker did. Of course, he was blacklisted, but nonetheless, he did slave revolts. He did a people's history of slavery and so on. So it was all there if you wanted to find it, but it was academic. But here was a popular history that really captured a lot of these academic studies. They were writing for historians. I think he was writing for the people. That's why it was the people's history. And as soon as I read the book, I bought copies, not for me, for my friends. And we were just talking about it the other day. A friend of mine lost his copy, and he thinks his buddy stole it from him, and he's reading it now. So it's just timeless in that sense. And it's a polemic, and history is a polemic. And I think we forget that. We let these academic historians pretend there's some notion of objectivity or some notion of what you deal with, some notion of understanding. They're really talking about chronologies. They're not talking about history. History is contention. It's fighting. It's arguing for a position. It's interpretation. It's searching for meaning. And he does a brilliant job of that. And you do a brilliant job of defending him against, frankly, what the quacks. And I think I would just add this, and then I'll shut up, but there's a sociology to this. This occurred at a time right at the beginning of the Reagan administration. And a lot of the left-wing authors that had their heyday, like Genovese, who you discuss, and like, what's his name? I forget his name. It'll come to me. But these were left-wingers until they weren't left-wingers. And we were going into a period of transition where Reaganism was becoming a more dominant thing. They were in the balance of powers. They were holding the balance of powers. So having a Howard Zinn with a popular history to show people was really so important at that moment. Really, really invaluable.
I was talking, I both my boys have had AP history teachers that use portions of the book in their curriculum. And I was talking to a friend of mine, Dr. Perry, who's one of the better teachers I've ever known, and he used part of the book with his AP. he mentioned something. I was talking to him about now that he's retired, his thoughts on education and so forth. And he said one of the greatest times of my teaching was watching a young man taking the history book of the people's history, walking down the hallway with it, and he was reading it not because it was required, but because he wanted to read it. It was from his supplemental bookshelf, and it meant a lot that he was able to engage people with such a powerful reinterpretation of what normally was being taught in the history classes. So this book's subversive then in a way to the power structures. Is that kind of what you saw with this, or why is this book so
Although,
dangerous?
yeah, so I think it's a couple of things. One is what I think you've just mentioned, that politically it's going against the mainstream sort of political spectrum. I'll put it that way in America. Also, from the standpoint of history, the history profession, and Zinn made this comment a couple of times that he thought the negative reaction to his work was based at least as much, if not more, on academic conservatism as political conservatism. So he was doing something that other historians weren't doing. I mean, Greg points out there were some historians who were, but mostly he was doing things that other historians were not doing. And so I think at one point in one of Zinn's writings, he said that attracts stares. Now he's talking about things we don't talk about. He's analyzing it differently than we do. Um, but also if Zinn's thesis is correct, that significant change tends to come from below, that's very much a threat to people in power, and that's something that emboldens ordinary people to try to sort of agitate for change. So those are some of the things that I think people don't like about it. I did want to circle back to one other thing that Greg mentioned about how Zinn is making arguments. So as a philosopher, that's something that really speaks to me. That's what we in the philosophy game do. We don't just ladle out facts. We try to organize them and arrange them into an argument and defend it against counter arguments and so on. And one thing I noticed is that all of these critics of Zinn pretty much ignore his arguments, especially his arguments about historiography, where he explains the reason why he's doing things the way he's doing. They all just ignore it. So, for example, many of these critics, they seize upon statements by Zinn that he is quote unquote biased and not objective. And they slam him for that without making any effort whatsoever to discuss what he meant by that. If they discussed what he meant by it, then we could have something of a discussion as to whether his position is defensible or not. But they don't bother with that. They just take those words and try to use them against him, assuming that people will just be bothered by the negative connotations, of those words.
I did the same discovery that you did in preparation for this podcast. After reading your book, and you go through 25, is it 25
It is
approximately?
25.
Okay,
Yeah.
25 historians, many of them prominent historians. These aren't, this
Mhm.
is not Prager University quacks. This is the
Right.
so I then start to Google expressions like book banning of people's history or criticism, conservative criticism. Trump a couple of years ago came out and said we should get rid of this book because he's a Marxist or something
Yeah.
like that.
Yeah.
Conservative talk show host just consistently, he's a communist, he's a Marxist. You can go through any of the Fox. It's prominent how people are after this book. That was totally off my radar.
Hmm.
You have 4 or 5 conservative Republican governors that specifically are legislating to stop this book from being taught. It
Yeah.
it it just blew me away how the contemporary politics is, and the book banning. This is not just crazy Santos down in Florida. This
Pat,
is
Pat,
a prominent expression of what's going on with our political economy. I don't know. What do you think, Greg?
Pat, it says something, but it says something. The conservatives understand that history you contend for history, you fight for history. They understand that. It's the liberals that believe that there's some kind of truth that they dig out, and it's just there. It's in front of everybody. Just present it. I mean, I think one of the things that the argument against these 25 historians, commentators, right wingers, it's a mishmash.
Mhm.
These 25 people is they don't do history. Detmer did history. I mean, that's what I was impressed with. He made arguments, and that's what I think comes ringing through when you read those. And he's a good writer. It doesn't. He's not boring. I mean, he could easily bore you with 25 of these responses, but he's very good on those things because he's a philosopher. I studied philosophy. I appreciate a good argument. Most people don't. But you got to understand, history is a battlefield.
Yeah.
It's not just
No, I was just going to say, yeah, you're right about that. And of course, well, first of all, with regard to Howard Zinn, I'll just mention one other thing along those lines. A few years ago, there was a state legislator in Arkansas who proposed a bill. I don't think it was ever formally introduced. He just talked about it, but it made the news. He had a bill where he wanted to make it unlawful in Arkansas, not only to teach Howard Zinn, but to teach anything that mentions Howard Zinn, which would mean my book. It would also be covered. So that was one point I was going to make. But also, as I'm sure you both know, this is really something going on in a big way now, and it goes beyond Howard Zinn. All of these uh, laws that are being passed, supposedly about critical race theory, this term that they use. And to give you an example of the absurdities of this is an example I read about, I don't know, maybe a year ago, that in Florida, they removed from the libraries of all the public schools in Florida a biography of the baseball player Roberto Clemente. And this book evidently was like a book written for like middle schoolers. It was mostly about his great Hall of Fame baseball career, but it had like 1 or 2 pages about the struggles he had due to racism. And that was enough. Someone oh, this will make people feel uncomfortable about race. So they pull this book. So that's, and in my state, in Indiana, just this year, they passed a law mandating quote unquote intellectual diversity in university classes. We're not even talking about K through 12. We're talking about including at the university level. So these politicians are going to try to determine the content where, oh, you don't have enough intellectual diversity. So let's say there's a class where a scientist is talking about global warming. These politicians might say, oh, you have to include the view that, global warming is a hoax, et cetera, et cetera. So, this is going on all over the country.
You loved Howard Zinn. He was one of your professors when you were just beginning college. And I'm sure when he died and you started to discover this became kind of personal,
Yes.
personal with you,
Yeah.
because here's a good person and they're trying to reshape him as something that he isn't. So go through a couple of these academics that criticized him
Mm-hmm.
and how you initially approached this. Well, maybe they're right. Maybe he was off a little bit here, but you detailed what they said and then countered this with great precision and accuracy to suggest that they're not being honest in
Yeah.
their scholarship. So give us some examples.
Sure. So, okay, one of them that I'll mention is Sam Weinberg. And he is at Stanford, so he's at a very prestigious university. And I gather his specialty is more history education rather than history proper. And his rhetoric is always very elevated about how, oh, we must have high standards, intellectual standards, and we must have fairness and all this sort of thing. And so he wrote an 8-page article called Undue Certainty, where his big charge against Zinn was that allegedly Zinn is just very dogmatic. He's just very certain his view of history is the only right one and everybody else is wrong, and he's not going to stomach any kind of nuance. It's just this really crude view that he wants to slam down your throat. And so, interestingly, one of the pieces of evidence that he uses, it's essentially a rhetorical point where he says good historians who are aware of how complex history is, how many-sided it is, etc., how difficult it is to determine exactly, what the right angle is, and so on. They use very modest language with a lot of qualifiers. They'll say seems, maybe, appears, etc. And Zinn extinguishes these words. That's a quote from Weinberg. He says, he extinguishes, he lists a few words that Zinn allegedly distinguishes. And one of those is perhaps. And so, pardon me while I check my notes, because I want to get this right. So here we go. So he says that Zinn extinguishes the word perhaps. Now, as you probably know, Zinn's text can be found for free online, so you can do an in-text search. So I did a search for the word perhaps, and it comes up 101 times. And I even was meticulous enough to go through and not count ones where it's in a quotation where Zinn is quoting somebody. So he himself in his own rhetoric uses the word perhaps 101 times, and Weinberg says he never uses it. And then similarly with other qualifying words, Zinn uses them frequently, and Weinberg claims he never uses them at all. And so here's another irony about that. And he uses, again, very moralistic language, Weinberg does. Oh, if you're a serious historian, you're cautious. You don't make bold claims. You qualify them in this way. But then I noticed in his article, he makes a whole bunch of bold claims about Zinn. Like, for example, he offers a rather insulting explanation of why Zinn's book has been so successful. And he says, "Oh, it's because we like Holden Caulfield. We like to just sort of tear down authorities. It's this sort of juvenile thing." And so I thought, gosh, does he really know that? Shouldn't there be a perhaps in there? So I did a search in his writings. Perhaps 0, maybe 0, nothing. So it's like that. Another example, Sean Wilentz, who is a Pulitzer Prize-winning historian at Princeton. And when Howard Zinn died, the Los Angeles Times contacted several prominent historians to get their thoughts on Howard Zinn. And Wilentz said, one of the things he said was, well, Zinn had this very simplified view where every left-winger was great and every president was a stinker. That can't be right. Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves, but you'd never learn that from Howard Zinn. So I opened up A People's History to the chapter on the Civil War, and on the first page there occurs the sentence, Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves. Now, he's making a typically Zinn-like point because he's comparing Lincoln to John Brown, where we sort of vilify John Brown, who tried to free the slaves with small-scale violence. And Zinn was saying, well, Lincoln managed to pull it off with large-scale violence, the Civil War. But right there, in fact, twice, he comes right out and says, Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves. And you've got Sean Wilentz. This is his, he gets to pick his evidence. The evidence that he picked is to show that Zinn is extreme and one-sided. All the presidents are stinkers. There's nothing good about any of them. What's his proof? He won't even acknowledge Lincoln's role in freeing the slaves. And it's just right there. And so I didn't say this in my book, but one thing that has occurred to me to say afterwards is a lot of these errors, like let's take that last one as an example. I want to make 3 points about that kind of thing. One, it's hard to come up with a good explanation of how you could make a mistake like that. I mean, I'm a professor, so I'm a teacher. When my students make mistakes, I have to evaluate them in terms of, well, what kind of a mistake is this? Does it really show the student doesn't understand, or is this more of a harmless error, that kind of thing? So this one, I can't think of a good, honest explanation as to how someone could make a blunder like that. That's point number one. Point number two, no one's ever, even these harsh critics, they've never accused Howard Zinn of making a mistake as bad as that. And that's true of almost all of these critics. The mistakes they make are worse than even any of the ones they accuse Zinn of making in their harsh critics. So that's number two. And then number three is, we're talking about a level of incompetence that is below that which we demand of a college freshman in an intro course. If a college freshman in an intro course were to criticize someone by saying, you wouldn't even learn from him X, and he says right where you'd expect it, he says X, you're going to get a really bad grade. And that's the level at which these people are working. And that's just two examples. And with regard to Weinberg, there's a whole bunch of things. I just gave you one. He makes like 30 errors in 8 pages
Right.
that are all as bad as that.
One of my special ones that I really liked was Mary Graber. Is that?
Yeah.
And here's the thing that I want to ask you about.
Yeah.
You're calling them out. They're obviously aware that they're being criticized, because this is showing up in Slate and other places where the arguments are occurring. And you called out Mary Graber, and not only did she not respond, she ends up writing a book specifically debunking, Howard Zinn.
Yeah.
And she doubled down.
Yeah.
Is this just a revisionist history like we came with Reagan? Reagan wasn't a very good president, but if you looked right now, Reagan was, right there with Jesus Christ and how wonderful a president he was, because of this revisionist interpretation and misinterpretation of what he was really about. I don't know what's going on with this.
That I don't know. I mean, I don't really have any more of an explanation of that than what I said earlier when we were talking about, what people didn't like about Zinn. I don't know why these things persist. Although, so here's something. I know we have a danger of romanticizing the past. So maybe I'm just not remembering accurately, but it seems as though things have gotten worse in recent years in terms of people just being able to make stuff up and get away with it. I suppose part of it might be, I mean, I had plenty of criticisms of what the mainstream media used to be like in the pre-internet age, where the criticism, or one of the main criticisms would be, it was just so monolithic. They were all the same. There was no room for for anything outside of a certain narrow spectrum of opinion. But now, where you do have a broader range due to the internet and social media and everything, people tend to be siloed. And so there's this echo chamber where just nonsensical stuff can just be sort of repeated over and over again. So yeah, Mary Graber, or Grabar, I'm not even sure how you pronounce her name. I mean, as I recall in my book, one of the things in there is she actually mentioned me because I had given a lecture about this stuff that was covered by a local newspaper. And she got me mixed up with the author of that article. Like, she thought the author of the newspaper article was the one giving the lecture. And then she combined both of our names. His name was Jerry Davich, and she started talking about Jerry Detmer. I mean, it was just stuff of not being able to read a newspaper article, in addition to all kinds of other errors she made in talking about Howard Zinn. Like, for example, she said at one point, this is not her book, because my book came out before her book, so I was criticizing other shorter writings of hers. She had said something like, Zinn never gives any credit to any of his predecessors from whom he got ideas. And then, like a page later, she says, well, he comes out and says he got his ideas from, and it's like a list of 30 people. So it's just full of amazing mistakes like that. Yeah, I can't explain it.
To watch her YouTube videos of her debunking the Howard Zinn book as she's being interviewed, I'm shaking my head and said, "Oh my God, this is like a Saturday Night Live skit." It just,
Yeah.
I don't know. Greg, what do you think? I mean, what do you think about are we revising history more than we have done in the past, or is this just an extension of, is just this the way how politics and history is sometimes are bad bedfellows?
Well, I think I go back to going to Georgetown High School in Illinois, across the border from Indiana, and we're back to 1965, and it's very much like today what it was then. I mean, the history we learned was a ideological history. It was a history of the heroism of the founding fathers, of the in those days, an American history teacher in high school was an ideologue. I mean, designated to teach American history in every high school class. And he or she was really telling you how wonderful America was and telling the narrative that Howard Zinn took on and challenged in 1980. So, I mean, coming out of that, there's now been a retreat. The balance of powers is different again. So we came out of McCarthyism, and we have a brief period of 15, 20 years where young scholars become Marxist or write the different interpretation, the Howard Zinn interpretation of history. And then we have the Reagan era when the balance shifts again into Bill Clinton and that particular worldview. And again, we're back to 1965. I mean, they're trying to it's revanchism, reestablish a narrative of American history that will make young people want to go off to war, make young people rally around the flag, make young people rally around the traditional values and so on. It's a cycle, and we fortunately on the left now we are on the wrong side where we don't have the power, and so the logic of the arguments in Zinnophobia are uncontestable. I mean, as a philosopher, at a PhD level, I studied logic, brilliant logic. I mean, really, it's just what you want a philosopher to do is there. But it doesn't matter in today's world. Logic doesn't matter in today's world, unfortunately. We can stand back and admire this book in any case for its logic.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you for those compliments. I really appreciate that. But your last point about logic doesn't matter. I mean, this is a thing that I find just very, very frustrating. That there are so many things that pass muster that just the most elementary application of logic or critical reasoning of any kind, would demolish it. But it just doesn't happen. And there's this tremendous tolerance for people just saying absurd things. I mean, so Trump obviously is an extreme of this, but I'm thinking about how he'll just come out and assert everything was great when I was president. And when I was president, unemployment was the best it's ever been. Air pollution was the best it's ever been. Just everything was. And then when somebody else is president, oh, it's the worst of all time. It makes it so like crime. Just to give one example, I don't think the presidents have much to do with the crime rate, but as a matter of fact, the crime rate was higher under Trump than under Biden. But he'll just say the opposite, and people just believe it. So there's the problem of a lack of the application of logic. There's also just a complete indifference to to facts and evidence. Just say whatever you want, and if it supports your side, it just flies. That seems to be part of what's going on in the current period.
But that's the sad part about your book. You expect that with our cable news network. You
Yeah,
expect that with politicians. You expect that with, I don't know. You don't expect that with historians from Stanford. You don't
Sure you do.
expect that kind
Sure you
of
do.
distorted
yeah,
ideology. That's the sad part about your book. These are not
right.
just
Get
yahoos
over it,
that have a
man.
YouTube channel that are trying to
Right.
get clicks. These are real
Get over it.
historians.
And with that in mind, I think it's really interesting that with only one very minor exception, none of these people that I criticize so severely in my book have tried to defend themselves. And just as a case in point, um, The Nation, I forget exactly when this happened, a few years ago, The Nation ran an article about Sean Wilentz. And the author, I can't remember if he said this as his opinion or it was other people's opinion, but he mentioned the opinion that Sean Wilentz was America's greatest historian. And so because he's so careful to document, everything he claimed, carefully, with footnotes and what have you. So I wrote a letter to the Nation, and to their credit, they published it. And in fact, in the Nation, the letters column comes first, and my letter was so. If you open that issue of the Nation, my letter was the first thing there, and I pointed out I don't have the text in front of me, but I said something to the effect of, he's not always so careful about documenting his claims. And I brought up the thing about how he said Howard Zinn said, you can't learn from Howard Zinn that Abraham Lincoln's role in ending slavery, and I quote. So they put all that in there. Now, if I were Sean Wilentz and it was exposed that I made a mistake like that, if I didn't have a good defense, I would apologize. I would say, "Oh yeah, I plead guilty that was a blunder. Thank you for correcting it. I apologize." Just nothing, just silence. Um, the only exception is Sam Weinberg, and I have. Let me just grab that really quickly. It was called to my attention that a person I don't know, his name is Mike Reynolds, had tweeted Sam Weinberg and said, "I would love to hear you respond to David Detmer. He seriously calls into question key aspects of your critique of Howard Zinn." And so Weinberg did tweet something back, and this is what he said. The Slate piece is a short overview of a 12,000 chapter. I assume he means a 12,000 word chapter with pages and pages of documentation. Judging my argument by reading Slate is like judging a 2-hour movie from its preview. Now, what's so funny about this is the occasion of this article that I wrote about Weinberg. I published an article on Weinberg, pretty much sort of excerpted for the most part from Zinnophobia. And the occasion of it was an excerpt in Slate from Weinberg. But I made it abundantly clear, it's right there in the first paragraph of my article. I'm not primarily talking about Slate, I'm talking about this larger article he had written. So he misread, if he even read it at all, my article. And then also, I thought the analogy was poor. When he says, judging my art by reading Slate is like judging a 2-hour movie from its preview, because a preview to a movie, its only purpose is to entice you to see the whole thing. But a shorter version of a larger critical article, you also have to have some standards. You can't just throw out a bunch of falsehoods and say, "Oh, but these are in a shorter piece." And also, the mistakes that I was citing are not only in the shorter piece, but the longer piece. It's just a disaster, any way you look at it. And that's the only one of them who's even replied at all.
You had fun doing this book. You had to have fun.
Oh yeah.
As you're going through, and I'm and you're saying, my God, it just was reinforcing the fact that there's something going on here that is deserves to be told.
Yeah.
First of all, Howard Zinn deserves to be defended. He was a remarkable person. He was a loving person.
He
You
was.
talked about how, he was selfless with his office hours. He remembered people, corresponded. He truly was a good person.
He was.
And it's and to have him as this caricature
Mm-hmm.
of Marxist, you know, horrible ideology that's destroying our children is just the mendacity of that is just beyond reproach. I don't
You
know. I don't
know,
know. I don't know what to say.
let me just add this. You mentioned him as a teacher. Now, that's kind of a minor theme in the critique. I think it's only one or two authors who go after him as a teacher, but like a couple of them do, and it's all lies. They'll just say, oh, he just gave everybody an A because he didn't care, and he had total contempt, for teaching and so forth. And that's just nonsense. I wasn't, it's not like I was it's not like he was my mentor. I was a philosophy major. He was teaching history. I just took a couple of courses from him, but he would require when students wrote a paper. Well, let me back up and make this point. He was not allowed to have teaching assistants because the president of the university, John Silber, despised him, because of his politics and his political activism and so on. So, in a petty sort of move, he denied Zinn teaching assistants, even though Zinn had a class with 200 or 300 students, law and justice in America. So, in that huge class, rather than doing Scantron exams, he had the students write papers. And then he asked all the students to come to his office hours to discuss the paper. He would have read the paper carefully. He had detailed comments, detailed suggestions, suggestions for other things you should read, and so on. And then he would engage you in conversation about other things. So in my book, I talked about this a little bit, about how the first time I was in his office, I was carrying a copy of Plato's Republic because I was going to a philosophy class after. And he engaged me in a conversation about that. It was clear he was quite knowledgeable about the book. He had interesting things to say about it. He wasn't one of these academics who was just focused on some narrow field. He was someone who was interested in the arts. He was interested in philosophy, very well read in literature and so on, and just really a very conscientious teacher. And another thing about him that was remarkable as a teacher is he was so warm and friendly that the students all liked him, even the ones who despised his politics. I mean, there were Reaganite students who still said, oh, he's just a great guy. He's just so funny. He's just such a nice man. So it is really quite galling to see, these utterly unwarranted, character attacks, by by these people.
Greg, you and David are soulmates in a way. You're both grew up in the middle of nowhere. You're in Kansas. You're in central farm community. How the hell did you fall in love with philosophy? What's the tell me about that? Because it's obviously a superpower you both have. I mean, it truly is. I don't get it.
Greg, do you want to go first?
Sure, I'll go first. Yeah. I had two routes I could have went. I went to the University of Illinois, Champaign-Urbana, and I took narrative writing my first year, and I took a philosophy course my first year. And I love both of them, and I did very well in both of them. And I come from a small town. All these kids from Chicago had me intimidated. I had no idea why I was at the University of Illinois. I didn't think I belonged. So when teachers praised me, said you're doing a good job, I liked that. And so I had to make a decision. I didn't type. I submitted handwritten papers. And the narrative writing, Mr. Skoufis said, you're promising, but you're going to have to learn how to type. The philosophy instructor, Mr. Swartz, said, you don't have to learn how to type. So I went philosophy. But that was my passion. It really was because it's looking at things. It's skepticism serves you so well. I don't believe anything until I dig into it, try to find out what's behind it, who's behind it, what the thinking is, what its basis is. And I've carried that on my entire life, and it serves me very, very well. I'm so happy I have that as my background. And when I read historians, you're blasting the ones attacking Zinn, but I read a lot of historians, a lot of mainstream historians, because my interest in Marxism takes me there. And the field is filled with bad arguments. It's filled with charlatans. It's filled with people who make a career, are careerists that really don't have anything beyond their career. I suspect that a lot of the dislike of Howard Zinn was because of his popularity.
Mm-hmm.
A man who had $2 million books sold in a field where selling 150 to universities is a big deal. Those people are super jealous of him, and that's the honesty of the whole thing. Back to you, David.
Yeah, that's interesting. So, a couple of things. So, on the first part about getting into philosophy, for me, I was always a big reader. I always had a passion for reading. And, I would go to the library and just browse the shelves and pick things out. And at some point in my teenage years, I think it was about when I was a junior in high school, I happened to pull a couple of philosophy books off the shelf and just really liked it and thought, oh, this is something I want to look into more. So when I went to college, I went as a declared philosophy major. So that's sort of how I got into philosophy. And just like Greg, I got good reinforcement. So if you'll forgive my immodesty in telling this story, the first philosophy course I took, an intro course with like 200 students or something, and when we had our first paper to write, the professor said, "Oh, I rarely do this, but there was one paper that was so good I have to read it to the whole class." And he read my my paper. That made me think, okay, maybe I have some talent for it. So
Yeah, yeah.
so there was that. But back to the thing about Howard Zinn and his popularity and jealousy. See, that's an interesting idea. I didn't say anything like that in my book because I wanted to just have things in there that I could really prove, whereas what people's motivations are, that's somewhat speculative. But I think it is a very reasonable speculation. He had such a spectacular success. Like one thing I learned in researching my book is as up to the year when I wrote the book, at least as of that time, the book People's History had the unusual characteristic of selling more each year than the year before.
Mm-hmm.
Every single year, the sales increased, even though the publisher only ever took out one ad, for the book. So that is a remarkable thing. I also, some of the people who criticize Zinn are somewhat on the left, not as much on the left as Zinn was, but somewhat on the left. And I wonder if it's because of how principled and brave Zinn was, in that he was not a careerist at all. So he would just sort of stick to his stuff. So when he was at Boston University, when I was there, he took on the administration, which was very corrupt and dishonest, and he was just punished for it. So John Silber, the tyrannical president of the university, would simply deny him pay raises. He'd go through the annual review and his chair would approve a pay raise because the chair is using the standard criteria. Oh, you taught a bunch of students and got good evaluations and you published a lot of things and you were on committees. Yeah, you did your job well, you get a raise. And the dean would approve it. But in the ridiculously hierarchical governmental structure of universities, the president can unilaterally change it. And most years, Silber would just change it to 0. And Zinn didn't change his behavior one bit. Okay, you're not going to give me any teaching assistants. You're not going to give me any raises. I'm going to keep doing what I'm doing. And when he retired, his salary was if I remember correctly, it's in the book. I hope I'm remembering this right. I think his salary was $41,000, which that would have been like in the 1980s, but even so, a very low salary for a full professor, especially one, of his level of achievement. So the fact that he was so uncompromising, so very principled in his behavior, I wonder if that made some people who were a little less so feel kind of guilty. And that might be one reason why they were mad at him. That's speculation. I can't prove
Yeah.
that.
And losing his job at Spelman
Yeah.
for political activity, and yet, in your book, you said people said he lost it because he wasn't a very good historian, but, just was, like he just makes stuff up. So, okay. Was this book more fun to write than the book on Renaissance, the famous group of the Northern Lights? You wrote a book on Renaissance, right? The rock group.
Yes, that's right. Also, I also love music, and there's this British publisher that puts out these books called On Track, every album, every song. And I don't like how a lot of music books, they'll just sort of focus on the big hits, and I'm more of a deep cuts album kind of person. So I thought it'd be fun to write a book in that series. So I made a pitch to the publisher and I suggested a few bands. I knew that Renaissance, no book had ever been written on them. So that
Right.
was one. They said, yeah, go for it. So I did. I take it you're familiar with Renaissance?
I, Greg and I are both kind of music freaks. We had on a woman that wrote She's a Badass about the history of 25 female rock and roll stars that changed the world,
Yeah.
and jazz. We're I guess Greg's more of a jazz aficionado than me. But yeah, I love
Hmm.
music. My wife is a rock drummer. I haul drum kits around. I'm her roadie.
Wow.
And yeah, and I do that. What do you play? Do you play guitar?
I do play guitar. Now you might find this interesting. I'm working on two books now. I haven't even pitched them to publishers yet. So I'm just working on them and I'll eventually pitch them to publishers. But one of the ones I'm working on is another music book, and this is on Phil Oakes. Are you familiar with Phil
I
Oakes?
am
Sure,
very
yeah, of
familiar with
course.
Phil Oakes. Very familiar.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's something I'm really excited about. So one of the things I want to argue in that Phil Oakes book is people tend to kind of look at him as a singing journalist, which is sort of how he promoted himself in the early days. But to me, what stands out is the emotive content in his songs. And I first started thinking about this when there's a live performance he gave where he did a song called Talking Birmingham Jam, which is kind of a comic song about the way the Birmingham police and Bull Connor, would attack protesters. And in Phil's spoken introduction, he said, even when there's a deep tragedy, oftentimes there's a sense of the ridiculous. So there's something sort of funny about it. So what I hear in a lot of his songs, some of them are very angry, some of them are very sad, some of them are very funny. So someone who cares about politics, they have a strong emotive reaction to things. And that's really what's going on in these songs. And nobody really talks about that. They just sort of talk about, oh, it's about this political event or that one, et cetera, et cetera. So that's sort of
Uh,
one of my two projects I'm
he,
working
he
on.
was brilliant. Yeah, untreated bipolar, and he
Yeah,
struggled with mental health issues, but that also gave him an edge and an anger and a power in writing that I think is important
yeah.
too. So
His life is very tragic, that's for sure.
so
Yeah.
you're at the end of your career, you're just doing whatever the hell you want to do, and you're starting to have fun with your writing. Is that right?
That is correct. In fact, I retired from full-time teaching just just this past spring. I'm professor emeritus, and so like this semester I'm teaching a directed study with one student. So I haven't given up teaching entirely, but I have retired from full-time teaching, so that gives me a little more time for writing. So yeah.
Isn't this fun, Greg? Wasn't this fun?
It is, and
I told you you'd
it
like
really
David.
it'd be a mistake not to comment on your writing because it's so lucid and clear, and it's not so common with philosophers, as you well know.
I do.
But to have the logic and to have the clarity is really a gift. And I'm even going to buy your book on Sartre because I came out of the analytical school and then into Marxism. And if you promise to be as clear with that book as you are in the book I read, I'm looking forward to it very much because you're a terrific writer.
Well, thank you so much. I appreciate that.
Good, good. Thank you. This has been a great Thursday midday, and it's a great book. For all of my friends that love people's history, this brings it alive, and really, really appreciate that. Before we go, for those who are listening to this, I have to describe my background is John Brown holding, rather than the Bible, a copy of the people's history. And both of you are familiar with that painting. I didn't even know about it. I just grabbed it off the internet. Tell me about that painting, David. John
Yeah,
Brown.
I'm just so amazed that you happened to pick that because I grew up in Topeka, Kansas, and that painting is in the Capitol building of Topeka, Kansas. It was painted by John Stewart Curry, who was a Kansas painter. And as you can see, it depicts John Brown. The original painting, he's got the rifle in one hand and the Bible in the other. And Here's an interesting story because I wrote an article about this many, many, many years ago, and there's a really great story about that painting. The Kansas legislature passed a bill where they were going to commission John Stewart Curry to paint murals in the State House because at that time he was a nationally famous artist, the most famous Kansas artist. Here's the amazing thing. In that bill, they actually stipulated this ties in with the Howard Zinn stuff about the battles over history. They stipulated Kansas history must be depicted in a calm and sane manner. No John Brown. That was specifically in the piece of legislation. No John Brown. So what does Curry do? He's got John Brown. He's got the rifle. He's got a tornado in the background. He's got a prairie fire in the background. Civil War soldiers killing each other, you know.
And wild
supposedly
eyes, wild eyes.
wild eyes. And supposedly the last thing he did is he splashed some red paint on John Brown's hands and then hightailed it out of Kansas. He didn't even bother to pick up his check. He got out of the state.
Oh my God, that's funny.
That's a great story.
I had no idea.
Yeah.
Hey, thanks a lot. This is great. I'm looking forward.
Thank you for having me. I really enjoyed talking to you guys.
Looking forward to sharing
Thank
this
you.
with our friends. Bye.
Bye.